There are cases that not only survive time, they defy it. They remain like open cracks in aged files, where the pages creak under the weight of questions that no one has been able to answer. And before this account begins, the researcher who reconstructs it leaves a simple, almost silent request. Comment on which city you are watching from, and what time it is there now. The case of the 15 missing horsemen in Thornridge Hollow in the winter of 1880 is one that time has failed to cover up. It first appeared as a whisper in local newspapers, then as an official note in the Washington County Court, until it finally became a thick dossier, stored in wooden boxes that survived 2 floods, a fire, and more than a century of rural oblivion. The setting where it all began was a small farming community on the border between Tennessee and Kentucky, dotted with cornfields bent by the wind and deep valleys where the light always lingered. Thornridge Hollow was nothing more than a junction of 4 dirt roads, a store, 2 reinforced log cabins, and the old shed where the Thornridge brothers, Elias and Merritt, kept their tools, harnesses, and supplies. It was a modest place, but known for the reliability of those 2 men who, according to records and testimonies, maintained a reputation for being discreet, hardworking, and respected. Elias Thornridge, the eldest, is described in the local pastor's notes as a man of soft speech and measured steps. Merritt, on the other hand, was more outgoing, but equally reserved about his personal life. Both had a reputation for taking good care of the community. They donated firewood to widows, repaired fences without charge, were called upon to assist with animal births, and attended funerals even for people they hardly spoke to. Nothing in the early documents indicates that there was any shadow over them. Nothing suggests open conflict, debt, threat, or disagreement. The winter of 1880, however, brought harsher conditions than usual. A series of cold, long nights, described in Nashville's weather records, hit rural areas particularly hard. The snow was not constant, but the wind that blew through the narrow valleys made everything harsher. Noises traveled far, doors rattled in their hinges, lanterns had to be reinforced with leather straps. It was a time when horsemen avoided long journeys at night. Not all of them, however. There were men whose routine required early morning crossings, mail carriers, military messengers, merchants who depended on dawn at local markets. According to notes compiled decades later by a Knoxville chronicler, a group of men from the community itself followed night routes out of necessity, not recklessness. They were accustomed to the terrain, knew shortcuts, and could distinguish natural noises from real dangers in the forest. They were considered men whom the wind respected, as one contemporary witness wrote. On the night of December 14, 1880, the 15 horsemen passed through the main road of Thornridge Hollow. Reports stipulate different times. Some say it was around 9 o'clock at night, others later close to midnight. But they all agree on one point. They were seen heading toward the Thornridge brothers' shed, where they used to stop to rest, change their horses' blankets, and warm their hands by the small wood stove that Elias always kept lit. And here comes the first detail that shifts the narrative into a silence that has never been filled. No official document records that Elias or Merritt opened the shed that night. The locks were secure the next morning. The tools, all of them, were exactly where they belonged. And yet, it was around that shed that the horses were found wandering aimlessly, and where none of the 15 men were ever seen again. From that point on, the records become less certain. The testimonies begin to diverge, and it is in this gap between what is known and what has been heard that the mystery truly begins, because the Thornridge brothers' shed showed no signs of a struggle, of entry, of use, of anything. Only an ancient, heavy silence, as if it had been left there on purpose. And it is precisely in this silence that the following archive insists on a detail that, to this day, no investigator has been able to explain. In the preserved records on Thornridge Hollow, there is a constant that appears both in later testimonies and in letters collected from neighboring families. Before the disappearance, nothing seemed extraordinary. It was a community too small for deep secrets and too busy with its own survival to dwell on rumors. Every recorded voice describes the same feeling. Daily life was stable, repetitive, almost predictable. The 15 horsemen, now known in the archives only as the December Group, had very similar routines. Some worked transporting packages from Abingdon, others carried supplies to small businesses. 2 were messengers who delivered delayed military correspondence. And there was even a man who delivered medicine to families scattered throughout the valleys. They were neither adventurers nor outsiders. They were neighbors, known throughout the region, men who knew where each road led, where the fragile bridges were, where the woods closed in too much to attempt to cross after dusk. Elias and Merritt Thornridge knew them all. The store's purchase records show that, almost weekly, the brothers bought blankets, tools, and small amounts of grain to feed horses tired from long journeys, suggesting that the riders really did make the shed a regular stopping point. There was no charge for this. The place simply offered shelter, water, and a little light in the middle of nights that passed too slowly for those who came from the countryside. Despite the peaceful appearance, small, almost insignificant signs began to emerge in the testimonies collected decades later. A widow from the region reported that, a week before the disappearance, one of the riders mentioned that the wind was different, coming from places that were previously silent. Another said that, in the vicinity of the shed, his horse had reared up more than once, which never happened. A third reported that when passing by the Thornridge cabin at dusk, he saw no smoke coming from the chimney. Something rare, as Elias kept the stove lit almost all day during the winter. None of this, taken alone, seemed worthy of attention. Just scattered notes, details that would only gain importance after the central event. The weather also weighed heavily. The cold of December 1880 was described in documents as a winter in no hurry to end. The winds came from the valleys, bending the branches of the trees and producing noises that traveled strange distances. Residents, especially the elderly, avoided going out after 5 in the afternoon. The horsemen, however, had obligations. They were used to dealing with the wind, the darkness, and the feeling of isolation that winter imposed on the region. However, some testimonies suggest that in those days, there was a different feeling in the air. One of the witnesses, recorded in 1923, already elderly, with a failing memory and a trembling voice, wrote that the men seemed more tired, as if something were draining the breath from their routine. Another reported that, although none of them spoke openly, there was a silent agreement that the nights had become too tight. Still, nothing, absolutely nothing, pointed to the tragedy that would follow. They were prepared, experienced men, hardened by the road. They knew that real dangers lived in the forest, wolves, flash floods, ravines. But they also knew how to recognize such signs, and none of them reported any concrete threats during that period. However, there is a particularly revealing document found among the loose pages of the local pastor's old record book. In it, the pastor describes how 2 nights before the disappearance, Merritt Thornridge came to his house to borrow a spare lamp, claiming that the old one had suddenly gone out. The pastor wrote a brief note on the side. Merritt seemed restless, as if trying not to reveal that he was worried about something. The next day, Elias did not show up at the store to pick up the bag of flour he had ordered. This never happened. Elias was punctual, methodical, almost rigid in his routine. When asked, Merritt replied only that his brother was tired and would stay home. The neighbors did not think much of it. Winter was harsh. Fatigue was common. But gathered together in the archives, these fragments build a discreet, almost imperceptible feeling that something out of the ordinary was disrupting the community's routine. The kind of feeling that only becomes clear when the worst has already happened, as if the past was trying to warn us, but no one knew how to listen. And according to a final statement from a 12-year-old girl who lived just over half a mile from the shed, there was something even more disturbing. She claimed to have seen, on the afternoon before the disappearance, the 2 Thornridge brothers standing in front of the shed door, looking inside, motionless for long minutes, as if hesitating to enter. The note ends abruptly, without explanation, without continuation. Just a short sentence, recorded in parentheses by the researcher who collected the testimony in 1947. She said she had never seen adult men stand so still in front of something so ordinary. And it is precisely from these small silences, the restrained gestures, the brief absences, the lamps that went out before their time, that the mood of that night begins to settle in the archive. A night that would later be remembered as the last time the community saw its 15 horsemen safe and sound. And the next document, which describes the last confirmed hours of these men, is as precise as it is disturbing. The last confirmed movements of the 15 horsemen appear scattered in short reports, reconstructed letters, and notes from neighboring families. It is like putting together a puzzle of worn pieces, where each fragment illuminates only an instant, and the next instant plunges back into darkness. Still, when arranged in order, these records offer an almost continuous portrait of the hours leading up to the disappearance. The night of December 14, 1880, began cold but stable. The wind, described by several witnesses, blew steadily, without unpredictable gusts. The moon was partially obscured, but the diffuse light allowed experienced riders to see enough to follow the beaten trails. The men had departed from 3 different points in the region, but all converged on Thornridge Hollow, where the Thornridge brothers' barn served as the only lighted place on that route. The first group, 5 riders, was seen passing by old Runnell's cabin shortly after 9 o'clock that night. Runnels, in his statement signed in 1881, describes the men as looking tired but calm. None of them spoke loudly, he noted. I only heard the sound of hooves and a brief greeting. They headed toward the valley where the road narrowed between 2 hills, forming a natural corridor of shade and wind. The second group, 3 men, was seen at Dry Fork Creek around 10 p.m. They stopped to fill their canteens, tightened their belts, adjusted their horses' blankets, and continued on without haste. One of the last recorded phrases from one of them, according to the testimony of the farmer who saw them, was, "The Thornridge barn must be warm now." The third group, the last 7 riders, left the home of a family they knew, the Halperns, around 11:30. In this case, there is a more detailed description. The host's wife stated that the men hesitated before mounting their horses again. One of them reportedly said that the night seemed too long for the hour. Another mentioned that his horse was restless. Still, they left, keeping the steady pace of those who knew every curve in the road. At midnight, according to the most widely accepted reconstruction, the 3 groups were already converging on Thornridge Hollow. The distance between them was small, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, and everything indicates that the 15 riders arrived in the valley within the same time frame. The last person to see them, a young woman named Harriet Cole, reported in 1896 that she heard the sound of multiple hooves echoing down the road, as if several groups had met and were riding together. She did not see their faces, only their dark silhouettes against the pale background of the road. She added a detail that would be repeated in other testimonies. None of them spoke, only the horses made a sound. And then come the gaps. The sound of hooves disappears at the bend in the road that leads directly to the Thornridge barn. The distance between that point and the property takes no more than 5 minutes. From there, no visual reports, none, confirm seeing the 15 men again. The following documents are attempts to fill in this blank space. The first subsequent evidence appears in a note made by Merritt Thornridge, found decades later inside an accounting book. He dryly recorded a time, 12:47 a.m., noise in the valley. There is nothing else on the page, just that. No explanation, no description, no continuation. That alone would be strange. But what comes next makes the record even more disturbing. The next day, around 8 a.m., and a neighbor found 5 horses wandering 100 meters from the shed. They were not wild horses. They were saddled, harnessed, tired, as if they had been left alone a few hours earlier. Footprints in the mud indicated that they had run in circles before dispersing. At 9 in the morning, 3 more horses were found across the road, near the irregular fence that marked the Thornridge property. The other 7 would be found throughout the day, each in a different direction, as if they had been released at a central point and fled instinctively. No sign of the men, no clothing, no belongings lying on the ground, no indication of a struggle, a fall, or an animal attack. Just the horses and silence. The Thornridge brothers stated in their official testimony that they did not hear men approaching that night, that they did not open the barn, that they did not see riders passing by. However, neighbors reported that Elias had deep, dark circles under his eyes that morning, as if he had not slept, and that Merritt seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact. The side door of the barn, one of the few original features still preserved in 1904, had a detail noted by investigators. The latch was stuck on the inside, as if it had been forced to close, not open. Still, there was no sign of a break-in. This led the local sheriff, weeks later, to note something that became famous in the dossier. It looks like nothing came in. It looks like nothing came out. But the horses didn't lie. They had been there. So had the men. Sometime between midnight and just before dawn, 15 horsemen arrived at the Thornridge barn and disappeared. The wind's howl that early morning was described by a distant witness as the sound of wood being twisted. It may have been just the barn resisting the cold. It may have been the wind in the narrow valleys. But that same witness added that, around 3 in the morning, he heard something lower, more muffled, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor. However, at dawn, the interior of the shed was intact. Nothing had been dragged. Nothing had been moved. Not even the dust on the floor seemed disturbed, and that is where the file presents its last concrete evidence, what many call the only human trace of that early morning. Between the internal beams of the shed, high up, almost where they met the ceiling, there was a dark, thin, almost invisible mark. One investigator described it as a scratch left by something metallic. This scratch was never explained. It was never associated with any known object. And it was never removed. It remained there until the structure collapsed decades later. It is with this scratch that the dossier officially closes the factual part of the early morning. And it is precisely here that the most distressing part of the file begins. The consequences of what the community found when they saw 15 horses without riders and an absolutely silent barn. News of the disappearance of the 15 riders spread throughout Thornridge Hollow before noon. It was impossible to ignore the fact that, in such a small community, 15 men missing at the same time represented not only a tragedy, but also a sudden void, the kind of absence that weighs heavily in the air, as if the landscape itself missed them. The community's first impulse was practical, to gather all available men to search the surrounding area. 3 search parties were formed. One followed the valley northward. The second took the road leading to Dry Fork. The third swept the area near Runnell's cabin. None of the groups found any signs of struggle, disaster, ambush, or escape. What they did find, however, were confusing impressions on the ground, overlapping hoof prints, as if the horses had moved in disorderly patterns. One of the most experienced trackers in the area, Silas Brumfield, noted in his statement that at least some horses had struggled, but he could not say whether this occurred before or after they were found wandering. The frozen ground and gusts of wind erased important details. County officials arrived 2 days later, bringing flashlights, dogs, and 2 investigators known for examining complex rural scenes. They cordoned off the Thornridge barn and treated it as the center of the investigation. They measured distances, recorded the horses' positions, and carefully examined the interior and exterior of the structure. Nothing seemed wrong. And that was precisely the problem. The sheriff noted, no sign of entry, no sign of exit, no disturbed corners, everything tidy. It is unusual for the total absence of evidence to be a type of evidence in itself, but in this case, it was. If the men had indeed come to the shed, and all the evidence pointed in that direction, why did nothing in the environment show that they had been there? The Thornridge brothers were questioned separately. Merritt answered questions with short, clear, but anxious sentences. Elias spoke less, choosing each word carefully. Both claimed to have been asleep, Both maintained that they had not received anyone that night. Both said they had heard only the strong wind. But witnesses reported that the lamp inside the shed, visible through a small crack in the wood, usually remained lit until late. That night, according to Harriet Cole, the light was not there. What came next seems minor, but it has sparked speculation for decades. During the inspection, one of the investigators found a deep mark in the ground behind the shed, as if a heavy object had been placed there for a few moments. It was not a human footprint, nor an animal footprint, nor a wheel mark. It looked like an irregular base, something that had been placed there just long enough to leave an imprint in the frozen ground. This mark was never explained, but it was also never seen again. The spring thaw erased it. The emotional climate in the community oscillated between fear, anger, and disbelief. Improvised widows waited for answers that never came. Children asked when their parents would return, and the Thornridge brothers began to be viewed with growing suspicion. Although there was no evidence against them, the proximity of the events made rumors inevitable. Some women claimed that Merritt had been seen walking alone near the valley at unusual times a few days earlier. A young man reported hearing Elias arguing with someone inside the shed, though he couldn't say exactly when. The time gap itself made the testimonies fragile, vulnerable to distortion. Still, something persisted, the general feeling that the Thornridges knew more than they were saying. Not enough to be guilty, but enough to be unsettled before the event. The sheriff, seeking answers, decided to thoroughly examine the objects inside the shed. Among saws, ropes, blankets, and harnesses, nothing seemed out of place. However, when he climbed a makeshift ladder to examine the top of the structure, he found the metal scratch recorded in the report. A thin, horizontal mark, about 2.5 meters from the ground. There were no scratches nearby, nor any wear around it, as if the scratch had been a single, isolated action. He tried to reproduce the mark using objects from the shed, but none of them produced the same type of scratch. The report states, "The mark does not correspond to any tool here." Days later, another detail came to light, this time brought up by a girl from the community. She claimed that on the morning after the disappearance, she saw Merritt leaving the shed carrying something wrapped in a dark cloth. Investigators asked her repeatedly what it was, but she only replied that it wasn't big, but it looked heavy. Merritt denied the incident. This contradiction was never resolved. The search continued for weeks. They dug near the creek, ransacked abandoned stables, and searched shallow caves in the hills. Nothing. No bones, no clothes, no weapons, nothing that could be associated with the horsemen. For historical purposes, it was as if they had dissolved into the ground. Not because of mysticism, but because of the total absence of plausible explanations. Over time, the county closed the investigation due to lack of evidence. The Thornridge brothers remained in the area for another 4 years, until they quietly disappeared from the records. It is not known whether they moved out of the county, sold the property, or simply avoided any further documentation. They too became part of the silence that hung over the case. And then came the most human and most disturbing revelation in the file. In 1901, a nephew of the Thornridges delivered a box of old family papers to the court. Among receipts, letters, and shopping lists, there was a brief unsigned note. "We couldn't stop them from coming here. We did what we could." The note does not mention who they were, nor does it explain what was done, but it is the only document that suggests, albeit vaguely, that the Thornridge brothers were facing some kind of problem, perhaps a conflict, perhaps a threat, perhaps something related to the riders' nighttime routines. The note was never authenticated, yet its existence changed the way historians looked at things. It did not point to anything supernatural, but rather to human tensions, silent disputes, agreements that never came to light. Thornridge Hollow, after all, was a crossing point between regions in economic conflict, uncertain trade routes, and rural transportation disputes. The exact motive may have been lost, but the human trace still echoed behind the words. The official file concludes its analysis with a sober sentence written by one of the last investigators who revisited the case in 1934. "The silence of the Thornridges, and the silence of the barn seem to share the same origin. And this is where the documentary part of the case ends. But the epilogue, written decades later by a historian revisiting Thornridge Hollow, now covered in tall grass, offers a final reflection on what remains when time erases almost everything except the feeling that something profound has been lost. When revisiting Thornridge Hollow decades later, it is inevitable that the first impact comes not from the documents, but from the silence of the place. The valley, which once witnessed the constant passage of horsemen and farmers, now rests in a quiet that seems to have become part of the geography itself. The old road has lost its definition. Weeds cover what was once a firm trail, and the Thornridge barn, or what remains of it, is nothing more than a crooked outline of grey wood, about to give way to the weight of the years. Still, walking there, it is impossible not to feel that the absence of the 15 horsemen remains engraved in some way, not as superstition or legend, but as what always remains when documents fail, testimonies diverge, and time locks doors we can never open. Silence, when it lasts for decades, becomes a witness. The historian responsible for the last review of the case in 1958 soberly describes the feeling of being in that landscape. It seemed that every tree trunk, every stone, every curve of the valley carried a memory that it did not know how to express aloud. He writes this not as someone looking for fanciful explanations, but as a scholar aware that some stories are not resolved. They just remain. Upon examining the archives for the last time, it becomes clear that much of what is known about Thornridge Hollow did not come from direct evidence, but from carefully observed gaps. The absence of marks on the ground, the intact lock, the scattered horses, the unsigned note. Each element points to something that was never fully said, to decisions made in haste, to situations that may have demanded more from the Thornridge brothers than they could reveal in words. Some say that Elias and Merritt were victims of circumstances beyond their control. Others claim that they were silent protagonists of something they preferred to take with them. The documents do not support firm conclusions, and perhaps never will. That is what makes the case so resistant to oblivion. Not what we know, but what is still missing. In a report written near the end of his life, that same historian adds a reflection that rarely appears in formal investigations. The disappearance of the 15 horsemen is also the disappearance of all the possible versions they could have told. It is a harsh but true statement. When witnesses disappear, so do the explanations, the details, the nuances, the small motives that could have shed light on an entire night. And revisiting the site so long after, stepping on the ground where the horses were found, touching the boards that still support part of the shed structure, brings no answers. What it does bring is a melancholic understanding of what time does. It does not clarify. It erases. It levels the extraordinary to the ordinary, the tragic to the everyday, the inexplicable to the archivable. Some longtime residents said that for many years, no one in the valley passed near the shed after sunset. Not out of fear of unknown forces, but because the place reminded the community of everything that had been interrupted. Families who never saw their men return, children who grew up without explanations, routines that had to be hastily reinvented. Life went on, as it always does, but the feeling of something unfinished remained there, like a weight on the landscape. Today, Thornridge Hollow is just a lost spot on the map. The road that once led 15 men to their disappearance is almost invisible, and the wind, which once carried voices and hooves, now blows through the valley without witnesses, finding only trees hardened by winter and ruins that no longer tell stories. However, when the historian describes his last visit to the place, there is one observation that stands out above all others. He says that he stood in front of the old shed for several long minutes, trying to imagine the men who had passed through there, the steps they had taken, the way they held the reins, the way they calmed the horses. He tried to reconstruct not the tragedy, but life, the simple, honest routine that preceded it all. And then, in a brief paragraph, he concludes, "I found no answers, but I found something that is perhaps more faithful to the past than any explanation would be." The feeling that not all stories want to be resolved. It is this kind of understanding, silent, human, humble, that remains when you turn the last pages of the dossier. Because Thornridge Hollow does not hold just one disappearance. It holds the limits of what we can recover from the memory of a place. It holds what is lost when records fall apart, when witnesses are gone, when the landscape itself changes. And while the old wood of the shed insists on remaining standing, even if leaning and fragile, it seems to carry in its veins the last trace of what happened there. Not a secret, but a void that has no answer, and perhaps never will, because it belongs from the beginning to silence itself.